Well, today we have a different kind of question that we've been asked, and that will be very obvious when I read it to you. Are you ready? Here's the question. Our son-in-law continues to debate his belief in Calvinism. We study the Bible and follow God. Is there a good scripture verse to use or explanation to help us show him that he should be following Christ? Well, there seems to be an assumption in your question, and that is that because your son-in-law is into a certain theological approach to Scripture called Calvinism, that he is not following Christ. I would suggest to you that that is, if that is the conclusion you've arrived at, that in and of itself it could be an erroneous conclusion. The simple fact of the matter is this, that whilst Calvinism is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, there are many, many people who are solid believers who would lean towards Calvinism in one shape or form. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. The term Calvinism, as used by many people, is a word that is used to describe a certain theological approach to the Scriptures. Now remember, theology is mankind thinking about what God has revealed. And that's always a very healthy thing to do. We shouldn't just read Scripture as God's self-revelation. We should be thinking about it, and we should ask the Spirit of God to give us insight into these things. Now, in the 16th century, at the time of the Reformation that was going on in different parts of Europe, in Geneva, Switzerland, there was a brilliant French lawyer who was a committed believer. His name was Jean Calvin, or John Calvin. And John Calvin, as a very young man, not only had a profoundly significant ministry in Geneva, but he wrote an incredible book that is now to be found in various volumes called Institutes of Christian Religion. It is one of the great writings from the 16th century on Christian theology. John Calvin had a very high view of God. He believed fervently in the sovereignty of God. And such was his emphasis on the profundity of God, the profound power of God, that he sometimes, and many people would think this, he sometimes went so far over in thinking about the sovereignty of God that he didn't really say very much about the free will of mankind. And here's the issue. And it's an issue that keeps cropping up whenever you get into any theological thinking about Scripture. How do we balance the sovereignty of God and the free will of man? There are what people commonly call the 5 points of Calvinism, and they fit rather nicely into, and I can't just remember off the top of my head what the word is. It's not an acrostic, it's a word like that, but anyway, you can find out what it is, called TULIP. And you take the letters of TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, and they stand for these 5 fundamental points of Calvin's understanding of Scripture. He starts with T, that is total depravity. Total depravity. He then follows with U, which is unconditional election. Then with L, which is limited atonement. And then with I, which is irresistible grace. And then P, which is the perseverance of the saints. Now you'll notice, if you go through those 5 things, that there is a very, very strong emphasis on God being the sovereign God who is working out his eternal purposes. My response to that is this: if God is not the sovereign God, he's not God. Moreover, if God is not the sovereign God who's working out his purposes, we're in a bigger mess than we think we are. And so I stand firmly in a position where I say, I am so glad that the Lord is sovereign. However, I don't go so far as Calvin would go, if I dare even put myself in the same sentence as John Calvin, because I believe that we have to factor in the aspects that talk about human responsibility and human free will. So that's just a very brief introduction to Calvin and what some people would call Calvinism. Let me suggest to you that you should not allow an emphasis in one way or the other to become divisive in your relationship. Obviously, I don't know you, and I don't know your son-in-law. My hunch is that all of you love the Lord, and that all of you have a desire to serve him, but you're looking at some things from a different perspective. Now, divisiveness does not come because Scripture emphasizes different things at different times. Look at it this way. The enormity of divine truth that God reveals to us is so huge that nobody can get it all figured out. Not only that, with the best will in the world, our minds are not perfect. They're fallen like everything else about us. So what we understand, we don't understand perfectly. So a little humility goes a long way. And very often, those who are the most ardent Calvinists are not always very gifted when it comes to humility. On the other hand, the people who resist them very often are not demonstrating an awful lot of love either. John, in his 3 epistles, talks a lot about people who speak a lot about what they believe. And this is what he says. You say such and such a thing, but. And the but that John always comes up with is this. If you're going to profess anything about Scripture, show me the reality of it in your life. And he said there are 2 realities that we always look for. Are we living in obedience to the commands of God? And secondly, do we love God's people and the people who don't know him yet? Those are the 2 tests. And so when we get into our biblical and theological discussions, keep asking ourselves the question, when all is said and done, are we living in obedience to the Lord? And secondly, are we demonstrating love for God's people and those who don't know him yet? That's where the rubber meets the road.